Good evening. Thank you, everyone. My name is Paul Smith, and I'm the chair of the ACS Board of Directors. I think you already know Lisa Brown, who's here with me. I speak to you tonight as someone who's practiced law here in D.C. for approaching 3 decades. And in that time, I've had the great good fortune to be involved in constitutional cases of great consequence, not just for my clients, but for the nation as a whole. That doesn't mean I've always won them, but even the losses have been very consequential. And I've also, in practicing law for all those years, had wonderful colleagues, both in my firm and in all the lawyers I've encountered in private practice, and in places like this, of course. But as many of you know, and many of the rest of you will soon know, private practice at its best is also a grind, with a tremendous amount of pressure on your time and on your energies. So I thought I might take just a moment before we get the program going to talk to you about why I found it worthwhile to squeeze into my schedule some time to stay involved with ACS, and why you should do that too. ACS, and this convention in particular, serve to remind me of why I chose and why I love the profession of law. They reinvigorate my conviction that law is a fundamental force for good in this society, and they solidify my faith in the future of our country. I hope that they will do the same for each of you as the years go by. We've had a wonderful 2 days of thinking, fabulous discussion, and practical strategizing about the most important issues our country is facing today, and we're in for more insight and inspiration, particularly, I think, inspiration as we celebrate the remarkable contributions of Judge Patricia Wald to the profession and to the United States. But before we begin that portion of the evening, let's give thanks where some thanks are due. It's wonderful to be in the presence of a new generation of lawyers and law students, some of whom I've had the pleasure of dining with tonight, and many of you have benefited from the well-earned travel scholarships made possible by our generous contributors. So I want to thank each of them very quickly. The exclusive national sponsor of our National Moot Court Competition, Boies Schiller, our underwriters, SEIU and AFSCME, the partner-level contributors, Leif Cabraser and the firm of Paul Weiss and their partner Jay Johnson, and the benefactors Aiken Gump, Hogan and Hartson, Jenner and Block, Mayor Brown, Munger Tolles, Sidley Austin, Sussman Godfrey, Wilmer Hale, and Wilson Sonsini. Thank you to all of them. And thank you also to all of our terrific patrons, sponsors, and donors who are listed in the program. Thank you for all of you who helped support this event. Let me also now take a moment, if I could, to thank, on behalf of the entire Board of Directors, the remarkable members of the staff of the American Constitution Society. Along with a remarkable number of great volunteers, the staff organize and execute this convention every year, and each year I'm overwhelmed by the work that they do, what they accomplish, and indeed what they help the ACS accomplish as an organization all year round. This group of people has enabled us to grow at an astounding rate, and I would like to ask each of them to stand as I call their names and remain standing, but please hold your applause. We've got a list of people, and we want to have one really good round of applause at the end of the process. First, of course, as I've already mentioned, we have this executive director, Lisa Brown, whose judicious and inspirational guidance. Hey, hold your applause, Paul. Come on.
I appreciate it.
It's the key to everything that ACS has accomplished. Then you've already met tonight Deputy Director David Lyle, whose insightful hand is in everything that ACS does. We have our amazing program department who put together this convention, much of it including our absolutely great Director of Programs, Judy Applebaum, along with Mira Trehan, Praveen Fernandez, and Caitlin McClune. Are you standing up, folks? Come on. We have, as you've already seen, those who work so well with the student chapters, Hazine Ashby, Stacy Rhymes, and Sarah Malkani, and those who also work so well with the lawyer chapters, Sarah Knight, Christine Kippens, Courtney Healy, and Yannick Morgan. The all-important development staff, George Walker, Jay Lopez, Melody DeMulling, and Bill Tucker, our brand new communications department with our great new director of communications, Alex Wohl, along with Jeremy Leeming, Susie Cohen, Daniel Schumann, and Rachel Cully. And then there are the rest who do so much to keep the organization going, keep this convention going: Nathan Clark, Liz Fuji, Stephen Rice, Leslie Lagomosino, Ali Roisman, Georgia Karageorge, and Andrew Mall, along with all of the volunteers that have done this. But let's give these wonderful staff members a round of applause. It's now my honor and distinct pleasure to begin the highlight of the evening, honoring ACS board member, Judge Patricia Wald. Early in its development, ACS convinced Pat to join the board for a single one-year term. 5 years later, we're finally letting that one-year term come to a close, and only at Pat's insistence that she is really this time trying to cut back on her commitments. So we're letting her do that. Now, during that one-year term that lasted about 5 years, Pat's been an indispensable colleague and leader, offering sage advice to a young organization that needed lots of sage advice. She's been instrumental to our growth, both pushing us and cautioning us, all with a deep commitment to our mission and to our goals. And on a board of stars with legal acumen and experience, Pat stands out. Completely stands out for the breadth of her knowledge and the depth of her experience and her wisdom. More importantly, if there's one person who has lived and continues to live the mission of ACS, it is Pat Wald. Her dedication to our Constitution, to the values at its core, her career of public service, and her ongoing leadership on the key issues of our times are a model for everyone here. Pat has been a trailblazer and it has a distinguished biography. She's one of about 10 or 11 women in her class at Yale Law School at a time when there were no women on the Yale Law School faculty. She clerked for Judge Frank on the Second Circuit at a time when there was no other woman clerking on the Second Circuit or in the Southern District of New York. She was the only woman attorney at Arnold & Porter at a time when the firm had about 12 partners and 3 associates, and they all worked in a townhouse. She was an attorney at Legal Services, at the Center for Law and Social Policy, the Mental Health Law Project. She's been on more commissions on criminal justice issues, law enforcement, and poverty than anybody could count. She served as the Assistant Attorney General for Legislative Affairs in the Carter administration in the late 70s, and then became the first woman appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, and later Chief Judge of that court. She got there in time for me to do my first appellate argument. In 1982, she voted against me. Judge Wright got that one right, Judge. She was a member of the International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague, where she heard cases on wartime atrocities from the former Yugoslavia. She was the sole woman on a 7-member commission on the intelligence capabilities of the United States regarding weapons of mass destruction. You remember that one? And she did all of this while raising 5 children with her husband, attorney Robert Wald, who's here with us as well. We have some more to say about Pat Wald, as you may have figured out, who's been a wonderful colleague and has become a very good friend of mine. But let me turn over the festivities here to Lisa Brown. Thank you.
Well, that certainly is a biography that all of us would aspire to. But part of what we want to celebrate this evening are actually Pat's character and her real dedication to the Constitution and values that are at the core of ACS. Because Pat is someone who has really lived her values, and I think that is an incredible example for all of us. She became a lawyer because, in her words, she knew that she could, quote, use the law as a means of bringing about reform. And she has indeed dedicated her life to public service, as indicated by Paul. What is not revealed in her stellar biography is Pat's approach to the law and to life. She is always open to the next challenge, and whatever she takes on whole hog. Pat does not know how to do something halfway. Everything I asked of her has been not just 100%, but 500%, and I hear that over and over again from everybody that she works with. And she also does this with a tremendous reservoir of integrity. Whatever the legal or policy issue that she is dealing with, she approaches it carefully, seriously, and fairly, and she is known for that. She's truly true to the Constitution and the rule of law, and is not someone who puts her personal ideology, politics, policy preferences ahead of the rule of law, which I dare say is something that is an example that we wish more people were following these days. Pat could well have been actually talking about herself when she recently described the vital role of the judiciary in our democracy as, quote, wielding powers fairly but fearlessly, reinforcing our constitutional integrity, and fending off overreaching by other branches of government. Through the power of her intellect and the force of her personality, Pat is what I like to think of as a superwoman defending our Constitution. And, whether, as Paul described, whether working as a legal services lawyer to ensure that everybody had access to legal services. In one case that I've heard about over and over again, when she ordered the Department of Labor to actually finally institute water and sanitation regulations for migrant workers when she was a judge, or now in her quote-unquote retirement, making the case for liberty, justice, and democracy in the post-9/11 world. Pat has consistently done her personal best to make sure that all of us live up to the promises of our constitutional democracy. As far as I can tell, Pat is never afraid to express her views, and she is known for her direct, forthright, and occasionally opinionated approach, always fair and always on the money in the questions that she is asking. One lawyer appearing before Judge Wald and Judge Silberman apparently fainted from the combined onslaught of questions from the two of them. Pat's steadfastness and commitment to doing what is right is reflected in her own comments about one part of judging, when she said, quote, you write dissents because you have faith that maybe they will play out at some point in the future, and because of the integrity you owe to yourself. There are times when you need to stand up and say, I can't be associated with this point of view. When you combine Pat's intellect, passion, and principle with her grounding in the real world, you have as effective and wise a counsel as you can get. And I have been privileged to be able to call on that counsel many times on matters over the last 5 years, and ACS is very, very much the better for it. And I think part of it, Pat is so effective at what she does because she gets both the complicated legal arguments and also the way that the real world, government, and Washington work. And it is that combination that is really powerful. And somewhat unique to Washington powerhouses, she does all this without being high-handed or arrogant in the slightest. So as Judge Tatel said it, and Judge Tatel, I'm plagiarizing from you here, at Pat's portrait hanging, Pat understands at her core that the legal profession has a special responsibility to ensure that the Constitution protects everyone. And her career stands as a shining beacon to the rest of us. She is a role model as a judge, an advocate, and a person. So when Pat stepped down from the D.C. Circuit, she said, there's a time, this was my incentive to leave, when you realize you only have a limited number of years in which to pursue any new or different endeavor, and a little bit of the adventure or pilgrim spirit rises to the surface. You want to try one more thing that's exciting and worthwhile before you quit. So as you leave our board, Pat, we are all eager to hear what that next thing will be, because we know you are not about to quit. So, Pat, we're really honored to be honoring you tonight, and we have a terrific panel this evening to do just that, to reflect on Pat's life and also on their own lives as judges. And we're honored to have with us this evening 3 of Pat's former colleagues and current ongoing friends, each of whom, Judge Tatel, Judge Rogers, and former Judge Mikva, each of whom themselves has been a pathbreaker, public servant, and believes very deeply in the values at the core of our Constitution. And to moderate tonight's panel, we have Elena Kagan, fittingly, who is the first woman dean at Harvard Law School, and herself, but for election year politics in 2000, would actually be sitting on the D.C. Circuit as well. And Elena, in addition to being a highly respected scholar, brings with her a tremendous commitment to public service. She was in the Clinton administration as the #1 domestic policy advisor to President Clinton, also a lawyer for President Clinton before that. And if you have any doubt about her influence, last year she was named one of the 50 most influential women, not just in Washington, in America, by the National Law Journal. So we are in good hands with Elena.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Paul. And let's begin just by giving another round of applause to Judge Pat Wald. What an extraordinary life in the law, a life in the law that every single one of us can aspire to and can learn lessons from. So it's an honor to be here, Judge Wald, honoring you tonight, and I'm sure that all your colleagues and former colleagues think so as well. You know, we were on a telephone call a few days ago. Almost all of us, I think Judge Mikva wasn't there, but thinking about what we should do at this panel. And Judge Wald kept on saying, "Don't talk about me." And other people kept on saying, "But Judge Wald, I think that's sort of the point, you know." So we came up with a compromise, and the compromise is that we'll talk a little bit about Judge Wald at the beginning. So she's going to be embarrassed for a few minutes. Sorry, Judge Wald, or a few minutes more. But then we'll move on to other things. We'll move on to what being a judge is like and to other things that all of you out there, I hope, will be interested in. But our first order of business is to talk a little bit about Judge Wald, and I thought that I would just ask the other judges on this panel to say a few words about her, to tell a story about her, something like that. But before I do that, I want to introduce the other judges on this panel, just briefly, but just so you know who they are, and I'll just start at the far end. Judge Abner Mikva, former judge, former chief judge on the D.C. Circuit, resigned from there to serve as counsel to the President Bill Clinton. Before he went onto the court, he served for 5 terms as a member of Congress. Before that, he served for 5 terms in the Illinois House of Representatives. He's currently serving as a visiting professor at the University of Chicago, and sometimes I pick up my New York Times and I hear him talking about Barack Obama. So a sometimes spokesman for Senator Obama. I walked up to Judge Mikva and Judge Tatel earlier at the reception, and I sort of patted Judge Mikva on the back and said, "My favorite judge." And I think it was Judge Tatel who said this was a dangerous thing to say in a room full of judges. But I get to say it because I clerked for Judge Mikva and owe him an enormous amount, so it's great to see you here, Judge Mikva. Judge David Tatel was appointed to the D.C. Circuit in 1994. He came from Hogan and Hartson. He was a partner there, and he founded and headed the firm's education practice. Previously to that, he was a director of the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Housing, Education, and Welfare, HEW, doesn't exist anymore, but then very important federal agency. And prior to that, he was the founding director of the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and the director of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. So an incredible mix of public and private experience that he brought to the D.C. Circuit. And finally, Judge Judith Rogers, who was appointed to the D.C. Circuit also in 1994, also an appointee of President Clinton. She had previously served she has an incredible sort of District of Columbia career. Judge Rogers had previously served on the District of Columbia Court of Appeals, including as Chief Justice. Before that, she was Corporation Counsel for the District of Columbia and an advisor to the then mayor of the District of Columbia. So we're honored to have all of you with us, and why don't we give everybody a round of applause. Judge McAfee, you were colleagues with Judge Wald, I guess, the furthest back, so why don't you start us off with a few words, a few reflections about Judge Wald, and maybe a story about her, if you can come up with one.
Well, I could come up with a lot of them. I'll come up with one, which I remember very, very clearly and affectionately. Pat Wald and I were both nominated on the same day in 1979 by President Carter. She had been in the Department of Justice. I was in the Congress. And I had never been nominated to be a judge before. She hadn't either, and we didn't quite know what to expect. I assumed it would be a big celebration, and being a member of Congress, everyone would congratulate me, and we'd be confirmed. That isn't quite the way it happened. Patricia, Wald, and I both carried some baggage as far as the Senate of the United States was concerned. And at a certain point, Senator Kennedy, who was then chair of the Senate Judiciary, called me up and said, you know, Ab, I think that's just going to be too big a load for the committee to carry all in one day. We're going to separate out yours and Judge Wald and Pat Wald's nominations. She'll go first, and we'll confirm you later in the fall. Well, Ted Kennedy was then and still is a very, very brilliant parliamentarian and technician, and I said, fine. Pat heard about it. She called me up. She said, I feel guilty leaving you behind. And I said, well, I assume it's just a tactical thing, and I'll join you very shortly. Keep a seat for me. And she said, well, you know, someday this might mean something, and I want you to know I won't forget about it. And I said, well, don't worry about it. Anyway, she went through, not without a few bumps. She'd been awfully nice to children, and that didn't bring unanimous support from the Senate, but she got through. And then in September, my confirmation came up, and the National Rifle Association had decided really to make an example of me. Not so much because they worried what kind of judge I'd be, but they wanted my colleagues in the House to know that if you took them on, that they would pay you back somewhere along the line. They spent over $1 million to defeat my nomination. That was a lot of money in 1979. My wife said, you know, if they were going to spend that kind of money, they could have talked settlement. But they didn't, and I was finally confirmed 58-31. I can give you the names of those 31 senators if you want them later on. And I did get to join Pat, and shortly after we took our seats together on the first panel, she said, I won't forget that even though I have seniority on you, it was a fluke, and as far as I'm concerned, we went on together. And again, I didn't think much about it because not that much turned on seniority until the time came when she became chief judge. Now, you have to understand, chief judges of the circuits are appointed on the basis of seniority. The most senior judge who is still alive, you have to be alive, gets to be appointed chief judge, and the term is normally 7 years, but you can't be more than 65 when you're appointed, and you can't serve when you're past 70. Pat became chief judge when she was very young. I won't even begin to think of what her age was, but she could have certainly served her full term. But had she served her full term, I would not have been able to serve because I would have been past the age of 65. And for a promise she had made many, many years ago that I many times had forgotten and didn't think very much of, came just before my 65th birthday. She voluntarily stepped down as chief judge so I could be the chief judge for the 5 years that I had left. I told her afterwards, I said, Pat, you must have the bloodiest tongue in Washington. And she said, what does that mean? I said, when I think of all the times that you had to bite your tongue when I did something that you wouldn't have done, but you never once criticized me for doing it. And I have to say, I've never had a better colleague on the Court of Appeals than Patricia Wald.
Judge Tatel.
These courts of appeals are odd places. You show up for your first day of work. They give you this enormous office full of books. You have 4 very smart law clerks. The paper starts flowing, and no one tells you what to do. Fortunately for me, my next-door neighbor was my old friend, Judge Wald, who quickly became my on-the-job trainer on the D.C. Circuit. It was Pat who I went to almost every day to get answers to all of those unfathomable questions about being on a court of appeals, such as, when to dissent, how to respond to critical questions or comments from a colleague. What do you do when you get an opinion from a colleague you don't like? Pat was always there. She was a constant supporter and counselor during those first few years. It wasn't until, I think, our third year on the court that we disagreed on a case. I wrote the opinion, circulated to the panel. About 2 weeks later, in the courthouse mail comes a note from Pat. It said, "David, attached is my dissent. It will do wonders for your reputation." I want to say one other thing, and what I want to do is I want to read 3 sentences from Fed Second. It's because of sentences like these that ACS is honoring Pat Wald tonight. And it's sentences like these that should be produced by all the judges that ACS supports. This is from Pat's dissent in the Don't Ask, Don't Tell case. For the government to penalize a person for acknowledging his homosexuality runs deeply against our constitutional grain. It has no precedent or place in our national traditions, which spring from a profound respect for the freedom to think and to be what one chooses. Referring to what she called, quote, "the injustice that lies at the heart of this case," Judge Wald concluded, "In years to come, we will look back with dismay at these unconstitutional attempts to enforce silence upon homosexuals. Pragmatism should not be allowed to trump principle, or the soul of a nation will wither." I rest my case.
Judge Rogers.
Pat and I go way back, and maybe I'll just take this a step beyond the United States because Pat's influence is worldwide. David Lyle mentioned somebody who's a guide, somebody who is a reminder of the principles that are important and why you're doing what you're doing, and also is a good traveling companion. Pat and I were in Egypt, and Pat was heading a delegation of judges from this country. And part of the purpose of the trip was because the Egyptian court system, particularly the higher courts, were interested in modeling their system after ours, and particularly the Supreme Court. Pat, as the leader of the delegation, and I'll give you full credit, decided that it wasn't just the court system, but the justice system as a whole that had to be examined. And so one day, we were taken to a model prison and shown how the prisoners were cared for, how the prisoners were educated, and how they were rehabilitated. And if you can imagine yourself in very bare surroundings, but clean, no chip paint, everyone dressed smartly in clean clothes and uniforms. And we're traveling down this hall, and Judge Wald is leading us. And as you know, Judge Wald is a small person, and the Egyptian guards were quite big and armed and in uniform. And they wanted to show us the prison industries program. And they took us to this part where men were working on little jeweled bags, like evening bags that women wear when they go to fancy parties or balls. And they were really, really lovely beaded bags. And one of the guards, the head, said to Judge Wald, "Do you like these, Judge Wald?" And she said, "Yes, they're very nice." And another guard said, "Well, Judge Wald, what do you think of our bags here?" And she said, "They're very nice, they're very nice." And if you know Judge Wald, she praises, but it doesn't go on and on for chapter. And they kept trying to get her to re-emphasize how much she liked these bags. Finally, she was able to persuade the guards that it was time to move on. The next day, on the front page of the leading paper in Cairo, is the headline, "American Judge Approves Egyptian Industries Program." That's just a minor example of her influence and the respect that she has around the world.
Well, Judge Wald, I'll just add my own few words. And I've never had the honor of working with you or working for you, so you're probably wondering what I could have to say. But we do have a connection, as you know, which is that my father was in Judge Wald's law school class, the Yale Law School class of 1951, and in Bob Wald's law school class. And this was actually 2 years before Harvard even started accepting women. So you couldn't have gone to Harvard, really, so you had to go to Yale.
Sorry, it's okay, I learned to live with
it. But early on in my life, my father decided that I was the one of his children who was going to turn out to be a lawyer. And he was very good about sort of telling me about women lawyers and women leaders whom I could use as role models. And so very early on, I knew the name of Pat Wald. And he, of course, mentioned to me often that you had combined this great career with having 5 children, which I didn't take him up on. But as I was growing up, you were something of an inspiration to me.
Right.
And I think he would have been extremely proud to see this evening.
Yeah, no, I remember him fondly.
Judge Wald, do you want any rebuttal time?
What's to rebut? No, I guess the only thing I would say is that I am overwhelmed with this honor. And when Lisa called me, I said, "Oh, that would be just tremendous. Only one condition." She said, "What is that?" I said, "No speeches." But I do want to say that I've been extremely gratified that I could be like a bookend to the American Constitution Society. It's my waning years and their beginning years. And it's been a privilege to work with them, to be part of really an exciting enterprise that is not only going right down into the law schools, working with these wonderful young people that we've seen tonight, giving them opportunities for leadership, but also producing the kind of intellectual ferment and the discourse for a vibrant democracy that's going to benefit judges like I was and Ab was and you still are on the court, and new leaders, because I truly believe that our country is on a cusp, and I hope and believe the cusp is going to go up. It's not going to stay where it is, and God forbid it should go down. And so I think that it's just tremendously important to have an organization like this. And I just want to add a few words. Not only am I so pleased that all the people on the platform are here, but my husband would be here too, and also all these people from every part of my former career that I can't name you, but you're out there, and thank you. So on with the show.
Well, we
Okay.
thought that we'd talk a little bit about what judging is like and what it's like to be a judge on the D.C. Circuit. And maybe we should use, I've given a good deal of biographical information, and Paul Smith and Lisa Brown did as well about Judge Wald. So you know about the backgrounds of these four people before they got to the court. And maybe we should start by just having each of you reflect a little bit on how your backgrounds shaped or influenced the kind of judge you became, or whether they did. Judge Wald, why don't you start us off?
Okay. Yeah, I think that we're all a composite of our experiences in life, and they really do enter into judging, not in the way that some of our opponents would say that we pick out our personal preferences or we cherry pick, but in much more subtle ways. Just to give a couple of examples, I grew up in a working class family, and all my relatives were worked in the factories, and I worked in the factories too, on the assembly lines, on the night shift, to help get myself through college and scholarships. And you know, we had a lot of NLRB review cases in our time, and it isn't that I always held for the union, but it was amazing the fact situations that you would read about, and because you had actually had some of that experience, you did have a concept of what was going on, or why somebody might be very upset about a particular practice, or why they might not be, or why something really didn't rise to that level. So that was one part. Certainly my experience in the government, in the Carter administration, since I was going into a court that had so many administrative law cases. That certainly came into play because I remember that in the second year that I was on the court came the Sierra Club versus Costco, which was all about whether or not the White House could actually put its say-so into an administrative law rulemaking, informal rulemaking procedure. And it was thought that some of the prior precedent in the circuit would say, no, you had to adhere pretty much to the formal presentation the way other people would. Well, I remembered in many of my experiences where Stu Eisenstadt, who was then the chief of staff over in the White House, and I know you've written on this subject, Elena, but the agencies would be at some odds, and he'd call us all over to the White House, and we would literally bang the heads together until you came out with some position which was within the contours of the law, but nonetheless, the agency might well not have come to that conclusion by itself. So I did have a sense of the fact that the White House did have some needs and some, inherent abilities, not too much, to affect agency actions, and that's the way I wrote the section about that. So all of these experiences, the last one I'll remind was a sort of amusing one. When I first came on the court, as Ab will remember, we had some older judges who were nearing the end of their career, and they were very gentlemanly. I always found they were very gentlemanly, but they did not particularly come out of the milieu that we had necessarily, and we had a criminal case about an alleged ineffective assistance of counsel. And one of the areas they said, well, there were these witnesses, potential witnesses they knew about, and they didn't go look for those witnesses or try to bring them in. And I won't mention the name, but one of the elderly judges no longer with us said, when we were talking about it in conference, he said, well, you couldn't expect that lawyer to go into that part of town to find those witnesses, you know, because you don't go there after dark, or et cetera. And having been a legal service lawyer and, you know, I'm no great physical example of courage, but nonetheless, knowing that you had a duty and you went in and, and you did it. So that I think all of those experiences do reflect, which leads me to a conclusion, gratuitous, I guess, that it really is good for judges to have had a wide experience, not just in government and not just in courts, but some experiences that bring them into contact with, I won't say real people, all people are real, but with all different segments of people out there. I thought even during the over 20 years I was on the court, I rode the subway every day. And even that was an experience which sort of filtered into how you perceived of situations which came before you.
You know, I still teach the Sierra Club case. It's a great opinion. Judge Mikva, you were a Paul. There aren't all that many Pauls that become judges these days.
I know.
Is that a loss?
Yeah, I think it is. Around the turn of the century, most of the federal judges came out of the political ranks. They'd either been in the state legislatures or in Congress, and it was a natural progression for legislators, particularly who had maintained an interest in the law, to go on to the federal bench. But then in the early 1900s, it was decided to clean up the courts. And of course, whenever you talk about cleaning up the courts, the first thing you do is get rid of the politicians. Now, it's true in many of the cities like New York and my hometown of Chicago, politicians had much too much to say about who the judges were, and worse yet, about how the judges ruled. And that was bad. But they decided that they would draw a line between any judge who'd ever had any political experience going on the bench. That was a loss, because I think that one of the things that people learn from the political life is the kind of variety that Pat was talking about, of seeing different people in different areas. First of all, seeing how to get along with other people, understanding that compromises are a part of the system of governance rather than some dirty thing that the principled people don't do, and also learning a little bit about humility. I think one of the worst things that can happen to a judge, and it doesn't happen to all of them, and fortunately it never happened to any of these people up here, but they forget the difference between being appointed and anointed. The black robe and the high bench and everybody standing when they walk in the room, it starts to go to their head. And they really think that their advice comes from Mount Sinai, not from precedents and not from their law clerks, but direct from the Almighty. And they lose first of all, they lose their idea of what they're supposed to be doing. But secondly, they lose the notion that that judging is a giving and taking. It's not some kind of inherent, you don't wake up in the morning and decide and say to myself, this is the decision. It came to me during the night, and I will do it. That's not the way judging happens. And I'm sorry that the political arts that people develop if they run for office have been so completely lost to the courts. I hope that changes. When I was a clerk on the Supreme Court, 5 of the justices that were on the court at the time had held political office. And I don't know whether it would have made a difference or not, but one of the hot cases of the time was the forerunner to Brown versus Board. And it had a different name. It was a North Carolina case at the time. And they'd argued it, and then they held it. It was May, and no opinions were coming down. And we had one of the justices down to lunch, and one of the clerks said, Justice, why isn't this desegregation case coming down? And this was 1952, and the justice looked at it and said, are you crazy? It's an election year. You don't want this case coming down in an election year. We were all shocked. We thought that was blasphemy, and wondered if some of us were even thinking, how do you impeach a Supreme Court justice? Well, think back to 1952 and what happened thereon. The two candidates were Adlai Stevenson and Dwight Eisenhower. Among other things, the justice said, neither one of them will read the opinion and they'll take different sides on it. Is that the way you want this important social revolution to come down in this country? And as I say, at the time we thought this was blasphemy. But in 1952, Eisenhower was running against Stevenson. I'd like to think that Stevenson would have read the opinion. Eisenhower expressed his opposition to it privately, even before that. But what would have happened if it had come down in that year and he had announced his opposition? Then would he have sent the troops into Little Rock, or would he not have? And I thought, again, that partly happened because 5 of the justices had been in the political arena. And I wonder whether that same restraint might have occurred with the courts we've had since, where almost nobody has been in the political arena with it served on the court.
Judge Tatel, you've had a career which you had government experience, you've had private practice experience, you've had nonprofit experience. What mattered most when you got to the court?
I think what mattered most was the accumulation of all of those experiences. If you're not careful, you can't approach judicial decision-making totally intellectually. It is possible to simply decide these cases based on, the case law or the statute. But as Pat said, our decisions affect people and institutions. And I don't have any doubt that my own background as a civil rights litigator and as a partner in a law firm and as having run an agency has helped me understand not just the implications of the decisions we write for people and institutions, but the importance of writing opinions in a way that they can be understood by people and institutions, and in a way that they convey the opinion's values. And I think unless you've had extensive experience prior to becoming a judge, I'm not sure, well, I shouldn't say how you could do this without it. I'll simply say that in my own experience, I think that background and that experience has helped me understand both those aspects of judicial opinion writing. The other thing I'll say about it is that what's interesting about the D.C. Circuit is that actually every judge on the circuit brings different backgrounds and different experiences to the court. And we all learn from each other. I know there's been many instances in conference when a judge who has a different experience than I do, perhaps a judge who ran a different kind of agency or served as a district judge or was a law professor or had a different kind of law practice than I did, brings a different practical experience to the panel's discussion that helps the court resolve the case or helps the panel better understand the implications of our decision for institutions and better helps us understand how to write these opinions in a way that they convey information and direction. After all, if you think about it, our opinions are really most helpful to the agencies whose decisions we review or to the people whose controversies we resolve if they can read our opinions and get guidance out of them. And as I said, I think the experience, my own experience and the experience of my colleagues contributes enormously to that.
Judge Rogers, you had been a judge, and indeed a chief judge, for some number of years, many years, before you came to the D.C. Circuit. Were you a lot better prepared than these guys?
Be truthful. I think that once you've been on an appellate court, the very first time you have to ask yourself a lot of questions about what is your role, what is the court's role. And so I had asked a lot of those questions, and I had struggled with some of the answers and experimented with different approaches. And I became clear in my own mind that an appellate court is a very precious institution that exists in this country, where the decision is not simply the product of a single judge's effort, but is a collegial decision. And as Judge Tatel suggested, you learn from your colleagues, both in terms of clarifying the point you're trying to make, and of course at times even having to give up on a wonderful paragraph that's not totally necessary to the opinion. I think also that my own experience helped me understand why this type of diversity that Judge Tatel was referencing is so important on a court. If all the judges came from, the same state, the same law school, the same private practice firm, and basically had practiced in the same area, you'd have a very different conversation on the court. And this is a conversation that can both be positive and negative. There are times when you and your colleagues just can't agree, but overwhelmingly, everyone is struggling to come out with a decision that is both, these are funny words to use without betraying too much, but I mean is appropriate, that speaks to the issues the parties have raised, that are properly before the court, and that fairly address the interests that are at stake. So, having been an assistant U.S. attorney and seen it from that perspective, having been in the Justice Department and worked with legislation that Congress passed, and then coming into the Corporation Counsel's office, where you're representing interests in a very immediate sense. You see whether the building is built in a particular part of town. You see whether businesses go under because the contracts are set aside. And then you move to the D.C. Circuit, where by and large most of the cases do not have the type of immediate impact that at least I as a judge can figure out. For example, we're reviewing a rulemaking and it involves an entire industry. So you're aware of that particular aspect that the rule affects. But I don't think we're always aware, or necessarily could be aware, of how the industry is going to react to our decision, because it's only a part of the industry operation that's before us. And I remember before I became a judge on the D.C. Court of Appeals going to an ABA conference where a panel of private lawyers were trying to convince judges not to write law review articles, but just tell them, did they win or did they lose? And then they'd figure out what to do next. It was basically all a question of the cost of a particular path, and it might be in the industry interest to agree with whatever the court said or what the agency said, or it might be in the interest to just abandon that activity and move on to something else. So on the circuit, I think you have to proceed in these cases understanding that the issues have such vast implications that you may not always be able, no matter how good the lawyers are, no matter how good your colleagues are, to fully appreciate the consequences. And therefore, that affects how you write decisions, how you approach these issues, and sometimes you're successful and sometimes you're not. But all of those experiences play into, hopefully, an appellate opinion that is better than if you were just working on it alone with your computer in a private room.
If I could just add one thing just to emphasize this diversity point, why it's so important. Whenever I look at one of your law reviews or a book, an academic, and there's always the original footnote that says, I want to give thanks to A to Z, like 55 people for reviewing the manuscript, giving me input, giving me insights into this, that, and the other. But basically, when you're sitting on a court, and even when you're sitting on a panel of three, I mean, you don't have the ability. You can't send it to your favorite professor, or you can't even talk to your husband. You can't even talk to your husband about it at night. He said that was a good thing. But anyway, it is really just the composite intellect experience of those three people, but yet its implications, on some occasions at least, are greater than a law review. So it's a heavy responsibility, and I think the diverse experience aspect can be very important. I left out the law clerks. You can always bounce it off the law clerks.
That's great. Usually when you're doing events like this and people run up to the stage and hand you notes, my experience is that 9 out of 10 times you can ignore them. But when they're really serious, they put them on red paper. And this note says, Dean Kagan, we need to end this program promptly at 9:30.
Oh, goodness.
We just found out the hotel has another function in here afterwards. One wonders about this, but promptly at 9:30, if we're going to do promptly at 9:30, we just have a couple of minutes left, and I think I'm going to give these couple of minutes to Judge Wald and ask Judge Wald about life after judging and how you found it and what you're going to do next.
Well, I'll answer the first part, how I found it. What I'm going to do next, I'm not sure, from day to day. I will tell you that I enjoyed the 20 years of judging for a couple of reasons. So for any of you out there, especially the younger people, it's a good position to aspire to. The things I enjoyed most about judging were, one, the independence. I mean, you are responsible to yourself and you're responsible to your colleagues to some degree, but the fact is that you can do what you think is the right thing under the rubric of the law and precedent, etc. But that's a remarkable kind of position to be in. There aren't too many others in society that I know about, even the political positions some of the time. The other thing is that you never, at least I never felt, have to work at something that you know isn't going to have some effect. It's not, I mean, you're an advocate and you can work your heart and soul out, and then somebody says, the decision maker says, sorry, you can't. But you do know, as a judge, that whatever the decision, even if it only affects a couple of people's lives, as apart from the industries, et cetera, that it is going to have real effects. So I really enjoyed that a great deal. I left because a little bit of the adventurous spirit. I left to go to the Yugoslav War Tribunal because I thought that the whole concept of bringing individual accountability to some of the terrible crimes that have been committed during wartime, in which there really was no precedent for holding the individuals who had started, incited, and sometimes executed these perfectly terrible atrocities, that I thought that was a concept that was worth devoting what time and energy I had for a period of time to it, and I've never regretted that choice. I mean, there have been ups and downs. There certainly were terrifically different differences between the D.C. Circuit and an international war crimes tribunal where the other judges didn't speak the same language, nor did the witnesses, et cetera. But it was...
That was sometimes true on the court.
Yes, I did. But this was externally provable that they were speaking a different language. But there was certainly a diversity of experience. I served on a panel with an Egyptian judge and a Portuguese judge, and we sat on a trial for a year of the Srebrenica massacre of 7,000 to 8,000 people, with a bank of interpreters and the witnesses speaking one Serbo-Croatian dialect and the prosecutors speaking French or English and somebody else speaking. But at any rate, there was what they used to call in the Peace Corps, I think, cultural shock when I came home from that particular experience, and suddenly you weren't a judge anymore, and, there were basic decisions. I ended up taking a sort of a potpourri attitude for it. I taught 1 year, I did some arbitration, but mostly I've been working with international foundations on human rights and rule of law, things abroad, some instruction of appellate, which is very interesting, appellate prosecutors from all the war crimes tribunals that come together annually, and they have to have training too, and there aren't very many judges right now. You don't have a corps of ex-judges. So, and I'm working with one of the private law firms here in town on their pro bono foreign, DLA Piper, their pro bono foreign projects. So it's a full life, but you have to work at it, and boy do I miss the law clerks. If I can tell you, I miss my colleagues, Ab, but I miss the law clerks. Most of all, and the secretary, but there is life, I'm not quite sure where it goes next, but I've got a busy schedule, and it's been very productive and satisfying. I will make this one point. The federal ethics interpretation, I don't think it's actually in the statute, it isn't someplace, now has it that if you want to do what I did, even though I would have been eligible for senior status and would have taken it under those conditions, if you want to go and serve for a period of time on an international court, and more there are judges on a variety of international courts, you can't do it in the federal system without resigning from the entire, so that you can't go back to senior status. Not true in the state systems. There are a variety of state judges that perform this kind of service, which is very valuable, never in conflict with your position as an American judge, and then come back and return to their court. And I think it would be a good thing for the federal system to reconsider that policy.
Judge Wald, congratulations. Congratulations for tonight.
Thank you.